I want to play a little word association game with you guys. I'm going to tell you a word, and then I want you to think of the first word that comes to mind. Are you ready? I said, are you ready, guys? Yeah? Okay. Hooray for audience participation. Good work. So the word is redundant. Now, unless you're telepathic, and that is a TED Talk I would love to see, I can almost guarantee that the first word that came to mind was not success. And yet, as a former practicing physiotherapist, this is what we were taught at university, that redundancy equals success. While therapies such as heat, ice, and massage may make a patient feel better, they don't necessarily solve any underlying problems. The underlying problem is solved when the clinician isn't needed anymore. So after quitting physiotherapy and living in Vietnam, China, and Cambodia for 8 years, it got me wondering, why is it that we don't apply the same logic to international charities? I mean, how is it that international charities can stay embedded in other countries for decades upon decades? Today, I want to show you why international charities need to have exit strategies, a plan to know how and when to get out, and that to truly solve a problem, rather than addressing a symptom, you need to make yourself redundant. But first, I want to tell you what I learnt from my biggest failure. In July 2006, I found myself in an orphanage in Hoi An, Vietnam. I couldn't speak Vietnamese. I'd never worked directly with children before. And surrounded by these vulnerable children, I hadn't even had a child protection check. And yet, here I was, a well-meaning 24-year-old, selling myself a lie, that I had something to offer. 4 months after arriving, a typhoon came through the town, and it lifted the roof off the orphanage. And the dorms were so wet that the children had to sleep on the wooden classroom tables. Now, at this moment, a pivotal moment in my life, I can recall the predominant emotion I was feeling at the time. It wasn't compassion. It wasn't pity. It was helplessness. And so, I did what I could, being a big brother the children could talk to, and then left the town a couple of months later. My exit from Hoi An could only be viewed as a failure. But what if things had been different? What if, rather than exiting because I had nothing to offer, I had exited because I'd gotten the job done? And there's a difference between intentionally exiting and leaving through the back door. There are tens of thousands of international charities in the world. And these charities have resulted in an incredible amount of good work being done. The number of people living in extreme poverty has decreased by 137,000 every day between 1990 and 2015. That's every day. And that means that since the time I've started talking, about 300 people have escaped extreme poverty, the lowest rung on the wealth scale. But at the same time, we have created a mega industry. International charities are no longer just well-meaning missionaries and volunteers. And some international charities I came across in Cambodia have over 1,000 employees. For many countries like the Solomon Islands, foreign aid, money from another government in the world, is the primary source of that country's income. So what happens when, like I experienced in Vietnam, we decide that we have to leave? Well, where does that leave the people in the countries we're working in? To truly create long-lasting change in countries like Vietnam or Cambodia, we have to get international charities to plan their exit from the beginning. To truly solve a problem, rather than addressing a symptom, you need to make yourself redundant. And yet, how many international charities today view redundancy as success? I want you to think about how the typical international charity measures success. And I want you to think about the last time you saw a charity that didn't measure it in one of these typical ways. The number of children seen in a year, the number of wells provided to communities, and the number of girls who had gone to school. Now, these are all admirable things to achieve, and there is no doubt that millions of people have benefited from this kind of work. But the problem with this kind of work is that there is no clear endpoint. This is what I call the hamster wheel of international charity work. It's all about keeping the wheels turning. You request funding, you do the work, and then you justify why you should get more. And this keeps on repeating. Now, if you want to know why some of the world's biggest problems are never truly solved, the hamster wheel is part of the reason why. Think of it like being a car mechanic. Some mechanics are great. They get your car to a point where it's like it's brand new and you won't need to see them again for a number of years. And others are not so great. They tinker away at your car every few months, just doing enough to make it seem like the problem is going away, but just doing a little to keep you bringing it back. And much like the unscrupulous car mechanic, many international charities simply have no business case solving problems. It's much easier to just address symptoms. And I can say this as I've had an insider perspective from working in one myself. In 2011, 5 years after my failed volunteering stint in Vietnam, I and my questionable haircut arrived in China to work with an international charity. I'd come into China in the 5th year of a 5-year program, so my job was to make it look like they were doing what they said they would do in order to get more money. But I struggled to keep the hamster wheel turning because I knew in my heart that the work that had been done was already substandard and ineffective. And so the big question, the question perhaps no one, including myself, was brave enough to ask was, why were we trying to justify another program when the first one was a failure? I mean, if we're not doing a good job anyway, why don't we just pack up and go home? I left China dissatisfied. I'd had good intentions in Vietnam, but no expertise. I'd had good resources in China, but no connection to purpose. I had to reconnect with something that worked, with something that was beyond simply spinning wheels. And I found that in a small village outside Angkor Wat in Cambodia. In 2012, through working with Cambodian colleagues, I met a young 10-year-old boy whose name is Ling. Now, due to cerebral palsy, brain damage around the time of birth, Ling slurred his speech. And this meant that despite being 10, he had never been to school. My colleagues knew that if we could just address his communication, he may just have a shot at a better life. And so we trained one of them, a lady named Pirom, in basic speech therapy, and she worked tirelessly with Ling for months on end. Not long after, I returned to that same village to hear some incredible news. And that is, at the age of 12, Ling is going to school for the first time. But not only that, a couple of months later, I go back to the same village and I hear even better news. Ling was not just attending, he was excelling. Ling was coming second in his class. But Ling was not alone. Despite 1 in 25 people needing speech therapy, there is not one single Cambodian speech therapist in country. Not one. And this means that over 500,000 people are unable to communicate well with friends or family, perhaps even go to school or get jobs. An equal number, due to muscle weakness, couldn't swallow safely. Food and liquid enters their lungs, they could get pneumonia, and they could die. But how could this be? With over $500 million of aid money coming into Cambodia every year and thousands of charities already working in the country, how could an entire profession not exist? I knew we had to act, but I also knew we had to think bigger than just flying people across to do little bits of training. So the simple question was asked: what would have to exist in Cambodia for us to make it feel like we had made ourselves redundant? We needed university courses, government policy, awareness raised, evidence base. And so we knew what to put into the university courses. We need pilot programs. And if the population of Cambodia were to remain stable, we estimate that we would need over 7,000 speech therapists in country. But given that we are currently at 0, that is an exit point that goes well beyond my lifetime and my children's lifetime. And so we settled on a point earlier in time where we felt comfortable knowing that if we'd done our job correctly, the profession would grow by itself. Our Charities exit point is incredibly clear. We want to see 100 university-qualified Cambodian speech therapists integrated into the public sector, and we'll do this by the year 2030. After this point, the profession will grow organically. The charity will dissolve and leave the country. We'll have addressed not the symptom, but the problem. Once our exit strategy was defined, I also realised we needed to have a local Cambodian leader. And so, in 2017, I handed over leadership to Chenda Net, a Cambodian woman with over 15 years of disability experience and someone we are just so lucky to have. And I moved back to Australia to support from afar. Chenda is now leading the predominantly Cambodian team and taking us closer and closer and closer to our endpoint every day. I went from being the founder and the leader to just a supporter in 4 years. So how do we get international charities to address problems, not just symptoms? Now, I want you to cast your mind back again to how the typical charity measures success. As important as this work is, there is a difference between addressing symptoms and solving underlying problems. To truly solve a problem, rather than addressing a symptom, you need to make yourself redundant. The good news is this: we in the public and as donors, we have the power to reconceptualise international charity. We can move beyond a model where we reward them on the basis of short-term outcomes. So wouldn't it be great if the next time a charity had to apply for funding, be it from a government or a foundation, it came with more relevant markers of success? Imagine if the next time you were hit up on the street by a representative of an international charity, they too were able to answer these 3 questions that you would ask. 1, how will you exit? 2, when will you exit? And 3, who will you hand your work off to? Thinking of how charities exit countries changes the way in which we view that word charity. We're no longer giving handouts. We're not flying in and out. we're there to do a specific piece of work and then allow local people to take over. Because here's the thing. When most people think of redundancy, they equate it with failure. But the reality is that redundancy is the ultimate form of success. Redundancy allows us to see more children like Ling in the world. And that's because making yourself redundant simply means being able to shift resources from one part of the world to another part, perhaps an area of even greater need. And serving those in the world who need us the most. Well, isn't that the point of charity in the first place? Thank you.